I suggest we start. We are 5 minutes in. That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. All I'm going to do is basically run through. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
Yes.
Good. So I see Sana's joined now as well, which is good. So what I was going to do was spend maybe 10-15 minutes running through a presentation on the potential introduction of Helm into Nephew. And then I think Sana's proposal was to have a discussion after that on the ways forward, question and answer, and so on. It would be good to get to some logistics in terms of the best way to organize around this in the Nephew community, and then wrap up at the end. I don't know, Sana, have you joined now? Do you want to add anything, or?
Karen, I think that's about right. I'm happy that you were able to see the agenda on the SIG architecture, and you're here.
Okay, well, I'll crack on into it then. If I can, share my screen. I'm going to share it. Can you see that? Is the screen visible to people?
Yes.
Yeah. Somebody has to mute.
Okay.
Who is not present? I think where is the noise coming from?
I think it's Bala.
Everybody can go.
Okay, let's try and see how this goes. Okay, so this is the proposal. Between Ericsson and Nokia, we had a discussion a couple of months ago now at this stage about the potential for introducing Helm support into Nephew, and we wanted to make a proposal to the community. I dug out the history of this. We made an initial presentation at the TSC back in end of February, or towards the end of February, with a good discussion there and some positive feedback, with a request then to bring it to the SIG Automation and SIG Network Architecture. We presented about a month ago at the SIG Automation. We had another good discussion in that session, and there was the I think John created a SIG Automation Helm integration sub-project quite proactively at that point. And then this presentation today now is to present a SIG Network Architecture, and so we can get an understanding of how we bring the sort of architectural aspects of the introduction of Helm together with the more sort of implementation-facing aspects, essentially in SIG Automation. And a bit of a recap on what we've discussed at the TSC. So what we've discussed there is that the use of Helm charts for deploying Kubernetes workloads is pretty ubiquitous in the telecommunications industry in particular. There's been a significant investment and significant amount of usage by many of the vendors in this space over several years. So we believe that it's critical to get Helm support as a packaging option and a lifecycle management option into Nephew in order to trigger Nephew, allow for more rapid Nephew adoption as we transition towards CRDs gradually. We proposed at that point to have an urgent discussion. We proposed in SIG Automation to have it then, which we've done since, on how we can support Helm in Nephew, and the goal would be to produce a framework that would enable Helm support in Nephew and to have it documented or considered for the release 2, potentially, or release 3. Some of the principles we discussed, and these are non-exhaustive and just kind of examples, the principles of being declarative, using Kubernetes resource manifests, using configuration as data as a principle. We're going to need it over a number of releases, so this isn't just a kind of a point in time thing. We don't believe it's something that will be needed for a number of Nephew releases because of the fact that Helm is pretty ubiquitous across the telco industry. Therefore, that drives the need for Helm as a first-class citizen. So being able to not just take Helm files and translate them and then discard them, but we need to have a mechanism to be able to sort of lifecycle manage applications that are deployed using Helm charts. And we think that Nephew should have the flexibility to support current and future lifecycle management tools that, in general, providing that they adhere to the core principles that we've mentioned above. And there are obviously lots of other principles having to be considered in addition to these. So we suggested a way forward was that we run a requirements gathering activity in parallel to the R1 development. So that's kind of right now, I guess. This sets out what it is that we're trying to achieve. We should baseline those principles. So baseline some of the principles, get into more detail on those principles, gather some more specific requirements and set scope. And potentially we could set up a short series of weekly meetings over the next number of weeks in order to drive this forward. Then the second aspect would be to run a study and a proof of concept activity during release 2. This would start to look at how we could do it. We believe, given some of the discussions that have happened on Slack and in the meetings in SIG Automation and the TSC meeting, that there are a number of different approaches with different pros and cons. So identifying an implementation choice shortlist, I think, will be the first order of call in order to figure out what we want to actually try out in a practical sense. We also need to be able to identify or create a suitable Helm chart-based network function or application that we can use as a reference example. And then from that, we would want to execute POC activities to select the best architectural approach. And based on the output of those two activities, we would be looking to define what would be required for a minimum viable implementation for a release 2 or release 3 release of Nephew, depending on how much engagement we get and how much interest there is in the topic, and also on how complex or convoluted the solution is, and I guess how ambitious we want to be in terms of the completeness of support and the level of integration of the Helm capabilities. And depending again on that traction from that sort of body of work, then we would increment and plan for a release 3 and further releases going forward as needed. And I actually got through that a lot quicker than I expected. I thought I had a couple more slides, but what I have in this deck is some more sort of feedback from SIG Automation, so I can flick through some of that to give some recap on the discussions, or we can open straight up to comments and questions now at this point. And if we get silence, then I'll go into the feedback from the other discussions, if that works.
That works.
Okay. So in the SIG Automation discussion, these were the notes that we made in that meeting. So first of all, and I haven't read these actually since the meeting in a lot of detail, so I just skimmed over them yesterday, putting this slide together. So first of all, we felt that there may be certain constraints in what aspects of Helm chart could be considered NFU compliant, or so are we looking to support Helm as a first-class citizen in a cloud-native way, or are we simply looking for a mechanism to protect investment while we transition? So that's the kind of one of the first requirements that we would need to decide on the level that we want to get to. We can see that a lot of network functions and operator requirements are based on Helm. So there was a kind of a roll call around anybody who present in the meeting at the time to see who was actually using Helm, and most of the vendors present were. There was some discussion about how customizable they are as a starting point. Are there certain requirements around customizing through editing Helm charts versus updating through values.yaml and so on? So some sort of maybe architectural principles that need to be applied in general to the Helm charts themselves. And in some cases, it seemed that maybe Helm charts are being edited directly before putting into production. In other cases, they're seen as only customizable through input parameters. And then there are different ways in which you can start doing rendering at the start, in the middle, at the end, or as an operator in the workload cluster, and there are different pros and cons to each of these approaches. One of the things that was felt was the challenging aspects of running a study in parallel to R1 because of the lack of availability or the airtime from the needed contributors. So I think that's the kind of the trade-off between trying to do this quickly versus trying to do this right. So it's a possibility that the architectural patterns that are chosen, so when we speak here at the beginning about the different implementation choice shortlists, I think that's the sort of thing that requires a good bit of thinking about it, and this is why we're proposing proof of concepts need to be tried out here rather than just going directly into an implementation choice. But there is an opportunity for review of those code commit phases, but the different patterns will have different trade-offs. So we could defer that study to post R1, or we could identify a plan for people who will contribute and people who will review it. And again, we discussed the need for some real world Helm charts, hence the reason why in the proposal we talk about the need to identify what those are going to be, so that we can understand and cover the scope of the complexity that we need to support. We think that Helm and CRDs can coexist. There's an ecosystem of tools. You need to find the right tool for the right problem. In some cases, Helm may make sense. Generally speaking, there was a desire in SIG Automation to focus on R1 before bringing the Helm discussion to the table. They're still developing concepts, so it's better to figure out how it fits in once R1 is solidified. And there should be some reference in the documentation for R1 that Helm is being researched for future releases. I'm not sure whether that's actually gotten in at this point. So this was what I mentioned there earlier. John set up another subgroup to handle the research into the topic. I bring it to follow-up meetings to take it further. But then we also felt we should bring it here for your input and then back to the TSC. So I've been kind of holding back on making any sort of setting up any meetings in this subgroup, partly because of the desire to focus on R1, but also partly because of the desire to bring it here to get a full and a complete view. And maybe this study should be driven under the SIG NetArc purview rather than under the SIG Automation purview. Subsequently, John set up that page on the governance page in GitHub to identify that Helm integration sub-project. So that's a place where we can start to do some of the work once we get into the meat of it. Then in Slack, there was some discussions around the support for pluggable technologies for handling KPT and Helm packages. We shouldn't consider one-time conversion because this doesn't handle upgrade scenarios. It should be possible to do shift left and shift right on Helm charts. We should consider support for Helm at its current level of functionality with extra features such as monitoring delivered vanilla in FEO, Helm charting, Helm commands, support for existing Helm charts for network functions and deployment. End goal, I guess, is that Helm is a kind of a current state, and the end goal is to move the sort of primary applications towards CRDs. How long or what the long tail on that will be, I guess, will need to be seen. We need to consider packaging and content. We need to consider customization, distribution, and lifecycle management. And then we also need to consider the degree of flexibility and the choice of packaging. So whether that's just KPT under the hood or whether the system can handle multiple packaging types under the hood. I think that was the sum total of the material that I prepared. It's not a lot of material. I didn't want to preempt the study by going into solution mode. All we're really doing at this point is identifying a problem and trying to figure out logistically how we as a community can work on it going forward. So with that, then I'm going to reopen the floor to discussions, and I see Tal, you have your hand up. I see you're off mute, but I can't actually hear you.
Tal, we cannot hear you if you are speaking.
How about now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I wanted to thank you again and mention that if once we do have the discussions going, I do have some initial research that I could share. And part of it I thought to bring up here in SIG number 1 because it might be relevant here. So supporting Helm could mean, I think there are 3 aspects that we need to answer regarding how far we want to support Helm. Because, so here are 3 points. One of them is Helm 3 versus Helm 2. Helm 3 has been around for a while, but I do know that there are network functions out there that still require Helm 2. It was a big issue in ONAP for a while, and it's something that we need to decide here, you know, how deep the rabbit hole we want to go if you want to also support Helm 2. And the reason for that is the second point is that many Helm charts come with plugins. That is custom plugins written in Python that are attached to the Helm chart. If we can support those, right? But that's, again, an additional aspect that we need to take into account because plugins can do anything. They can get runtime data from other systems, etc. So once we have if we need to support Helm plugins, it could be another challenge for support. And this relates to the third point regarding runtime data. So the easiest way to support Helm is that if you can just render the resources locally, and then we can feed them into the system as usual, just as Kubernetes resources, KET packages, which is the way all of Nephi works right now. However, Helm charts that depend on runtime data, that is, that they can only be rendered in a running cluster, that would be more problematic in our current workflow, right? Because that would have to be pushed towards the end when you actually have an edge cluster running and can render there. So depending on how far, how much these three aspects are important, that this could really define our options in terms of support. So I know this is jumping ahead a little bit, but I think here in SIG number 1, we can define really how comprehensive our support can be, because we can say something like, well, you know what, there are some Helm charts that have plugins. We won't support those. We'll support maybe 80% of Helm charts out there. There might be 20% of Helm charts that we won't be able to support in FU, right? So that's the point I wanted to make. And I think that's for all of us to decide as a community how comprehensive we want. Do we want 100%, or would we be okay with less than that? And it's hard to estimate how much less than that would be, because I don't know out there in the wild how many network functions still are using, for example, Python plugins.
Right, Tol. Tol, I think one of the outcomes of the session was to basically gather feedback from SIG architecture and to take a step back, not thinking about what percentage of Helm are we looking for support, or basically come back to this feedback, but take a step back and see why this community was interested in FU to begin with. What were our existing challenges? What did we want to solve with Helm? We are currently using Helm. I have hundreds of applications that are dependent on Helm today. We have certain challenges with Helm, right? We use values files. The value files is very customized. We are already using values files. If it's considered a good design practice. One values file has thousands of parameters, and every time we are deploying it from site to site, nobody has the knowledge of those values files. We have to go back to vendors. We have to update those values files, and it's a lot of work. I'll be very honest. What kind of automation is this in which we have to spend weeks in updating a values file going from site to site? That is my problem number one. Being a service provider, I'm not wearing a SIG Arc chair hat right now. I'm wearing a service provider's hat right now. What was my biggest incentive in Nephew at that stage? So one of the ideas that I was hoping would come from the Nephew automation was our ability to manage our day 2 plus ops. Once the application is deployed, we will be able to manage the life cycle of the application in Kubernetes ways. And operators was a meaningful and a strong, powerful idea to me at that stage. So how do we handle operators and Helm? With Helm, that's my question. Like, to which degree do we consume Helm in which we can still run operators to manage the full day 2 plus of the application? The telco applications are not fire and forget. Like, you don't just run it on the cloud and they can run for the rest of your life perfectly. We have a lot to do with the runtime, and the services require them to change the application's characteristics in the runtime. What is the most optimal way of managing that? That is my another huge problem with the existing way how we are dealing with Helm. And another big question that is also coming in my mind is that, are we trying to consider Helm for the protection of the existing investment, or there are certain requirements or certain functions of the network functions that can be best met by Helm and not through other templates? Say if you want to develop operators and CRDs alone for that, like that was the initial concept of Nephew. And I am discovering that there are some vendors who have developed operators for their 5G core, and some service providers are already using them. They are in the community. I'm going to give them an opportunity to speak about their experience if that's better than how we are working with Helm today. So I think we want to take a step back in this community. We want to consider all the challenges that we are currently facing. What were our hopes and expectations from the automation that is done on Nephew, and how we want to solve that? I think that will give a little bit of more guiding direction in making the decisions forward in terms of what do we do. We still want improvement in the space. We want the challenges that we're facing today to be better. And you made a very good point on plugins, Tol. I hate plugins. There are hundreds of plugins. Every vendor is coming to solve a problem in an extremely customized way through a distinct plugin, and that plugin is only good for that particular state problem. How are we handling the kettle approach? Like, it's a very pet-like approach in which we are writing custom plugins in every situation. So these are all my big questions. And of course, this is a very high level right now. We need to get to the details of those problems. Then another big question is how we were managing the policy and closed loop. I'm hoping that we are not managing it the way the own app handled that. The policies were written outside the templates of the network functions as discrete plugins in rules or Python or some other languages. It was very difficult for us to feed in the data from the network function to another entity, another brain, basically sitting outside of Kubernetes, to give it the problem, the trigger, and create the condition, and then take your action on it outside the Kubernetes. How can we manage that effectively if we are still sticking with Helm and CRDs? I know this is the present. We are already using a combination of CRDs and Helm, and that is my production environment today. But it's not ideal. How do we move forward from this stage into something faster, easier, better, right? I'm just dumping out my thoughts. I want to open the floor to other service providers and maybe take it a little in a systematic way. How can we best describe our requirements that can actually create the guiding light for this problem to be solved? And if anybody is basically free to share your comments. I haven't seen any raised hands, but Kiran, if you have any comments on the questions, or Tol, you have any questions on on these ideas, happy to take the discussion.
A very, very quick one. You mentioned policies and how they're out of bound and very problematic. We have not talked about policies at all so far at Nefio, but I imagine just the approach and principles that we've been applying so far is that we strongly reject out-of-band data. That as we're really working hard, I think everybody in Nefio to make sure that we don't get into that where we have other entities that are different. We might not always succeed, but I think that's been a guiding principle for us to stick to KRM and not introduce new entities and new ways of doing things. So we'll see. This is a topic for the future, but I'm just as our North Star, just to remember exactly what you said right now, which I think some very good points, that we want to exactly avoid the kind of mess that we have right now, where packages involve multiple languages, multiple things that look very different from each other.
Right.
I think these are all reasonable comments. I've nothing inherently just against them. My view on it is logistically we need to start writing down some of the requirements and agreeing, as we said earlier, maybe on the trade-off. There's 3 hands up now, so maybe I can stop talking. I didn't see who went up first, so maybe
Kaushik
Kaushik
left to right.
Yeah, so hey, thank you for the topic and the presentation, right? One of the things that we should also debate is Helm as a package management tool versus Helm with the values file for all of the configuration data itself, right? In the former, Helm can potentially package CRDs and operators, and that may be potentially a viable option, right? But we kind of curtail the scope of Helm from that lens. And I wanted to bring it out to the community that is something that will be worthwhile to also evaluate without having to, like, how can we slice and dice Helm and look at key capabilities that are in compliance with Nefio's stated objectives?
My quick comment. I'm sorry, I couldn't raise hands, so that's why I'm talking like this. Sorry, but the comment was, yeah, Helm is for deployment through the the application can be complicated, so that's why Helm organize it, and then providing some value file as a template. So they facilitate some deployment, but the configuration, that's another story. That's the kind of limitation to SIMI. I see it that way. And in ONAP, task comment in ONAP, we decide support Helm 3 only. I think the nephew, if we start the Helm support, I think we should consider 3 only, because then we can look back to Helm 2. But my suggestion is to Helm 3 support first, because ONAP did take the same path that way. We only support Helm 3.
Yeah, I think that's probably reasonable to sort of push for supporting the latest version only. And we can formalize that, I guess, when we write something down as a document. Liam, I think you were next.
Sorry, I was struggling to find the mute button. Yeah, just on policy as kind of my 40 and ONAP, but yeah, I'm very interested to see how policy would work in this in the nephew world. Certainly, it's probably a little bit too heavyweight, the admin around it in ONAP. But I'd probably be in a good place to make a few suggestions. But I think that's probably in R3 or R4 territory before we bring in something like that. But we have the concept of kind of compositions that we have in ONAP now for tying everything together is something I'm thinking about here a little bit. Need to learn. I need to kind of get to see how those sort of things could fit into nephew. But look, it's something we can probably look at in the future. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Sam. I think Ravi was next.
I think probably it's kind of intersects with what Liam is talking about in terms of policy, because a lot of the work, I mean, if you look at what is being done in R1, it's primarily a shift kind of a shift left or shift right, I guess shift right model. But basically, a lot of things what we talk in terms of Helm is basically KRM resources that applies to the kind of the actual edge clusters, right? And what we talk in terms of management is mostly the intention, and basically going from the intention to a more level of specialization, and then only a subset of those actually gets applied in the edge clusters. So it seems to be, I mean, so unless you are kind of taking the current definitions of Helm and kind of raising it to that management level functionalities, probably, and then, I mean, you have to, I mean, it's good to understand exactly how, at what architectural level of nephew do we kind of intersect Helm. Because, as what, at least with what I've been seeing, a lot of these definitions are kind of pushed through certain operators in the edge clusters, where the actual workload resources are actually kind of applied. So yeah, so I mean, this seems to be kind of again that debate between the shift right or the shift left model. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think Tal, you had a comment in the chat on that as well. You need Helm that does not deploy operators as the extreme version of shift left, I think you meant. Thanks, Ravi. I think it was Eric and then Vim.
Yeah, so I think I share most of Sana comments. So yes, today to deploy a network function using Helm chart, it's very difficult because most of them include a large number of parameters, difficult to manage. And last but not least, also with Helm, sometimes we have so many, let's say, conditions, and to know exactly which value will be deployed, it's not always simple to detect. And I can tell you also sometimes when we try to deploy, let's say, a solution in one environment on the same solution in another one, we can discover that some, let's say, some parameters that are not well templated and so on. So it's yeah, it's not easy to have all these hundreds of parameters to manage. And we believe also that using this kind of CRD on operators can help us to have this it's a better abstraction and to avoid managing so many parameters. So that's something we all agree on. So meanwhile, I think I understand the requirement to use Helm because it's maybe not the best tool, but let's say it's the tool that is widely used today by most of network function provider. Yes, I can understand that some vendors want to keep their investment on this M charts, but I think if we keep Helm in Nefio, we should be strict in the way to use M charts and to provide, let's say, some strong recommendation how to use this M chart to avoid let's say the pain we face today when deploying them. And I think the most important part is also, as said, Sana, we need a solution to facilitate the way also we manage the lifecycle management of our network function.
Okay. Strict rules make sense.
Yeah.
I guess. I mean, what we were trying to get to at the beginning of the presentation was, it's protecting the investment, but it's also enabling Nefio to get more traction quicker, given the already large amount of network functions that come with Helm support. But maybe if we can support the well-behaved Helm deployed applications using Nefio, and then Nefio can add value above and around that, then I think that is a win-win situation. Okay.
And I also agree with Sana about policy management, and if we can, because I used to work with SONAP on managing policy with SONAP. I'm sorry, Liam, but it's not so easy. And if we can reuse, let's say, the same model, the same KRM model to define policy, it should be it should be easier. So I think it's the right target.
Yeah, I'm not sure policy is something we're going to cover under the Helm discussion necessarily, but it's certainly something I think we should learn from our previous experiences and try and improve. Wim, are you?
Yeah, Wim is next.
Yeah, I think I'm next. Yeah. So I first wanted to make a general comment. Is that it's not because we are going to CRDs that parameters are no longer needed, right? So in other words, you could also do a bad design in CRDs where you expose all of these parameters if we are not careful. So we should, I agree, we should avoid doing that, but it's not, Helm, the parameterization is an attribute of Helm that, of course, is the way that you interface with it, right? So, and as a result, okay, a lot of vendors expose a lot of parameters because they have a lot of options. So you could do the same with CRD, is what I'm trying to say. So that's one comment. So, but that's not what I raised my hand. So why I raised my hand was, I think I saw, and by the way, I'm not speaking necessarily as Nokia right now. I think the end goal is CRDs, is what we are saying. So that's, I think, should be, I think, is a very important probably decision that we have to make. If we believe that the end goal is CRDs, then I would, if we gather the requirements, I would try to start from the bare minimum of Helm support, if you see what I mean. So, because I think from what I saw within our company, the reason why we would like to support is main to protect our investment. But if we are heading towards CRDs, then we should retain, so we should keep that investment, try to put it into the system, but then we don't want to have too much exposure or development inside of Helm. So as such, what I'm trying to say is that if we gather these requirements, can we start from the bare minimum and then go up if there is really important needs, rather than trying to go from, hey, here is all the possibilities, and then everyone will say yes to everything, and then we have to do everything on the planet. So what I'm proposing is we start from the bare minimum set, and then, of course, if there is a very good reason, we go up probably. But I would go here in this exercise to try to keep it to the bare bone, and then move up the ladder if need be. But that would be a suggestion from myself, if we agree.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it comes back to Tal's comment as well around the 80-20 rule, whereby if we can get, a good level of support for a large number of network functions that are well behaved with a minimum amount of effort, then I think that's the pragmatic stopping point. It also depends on how much people engage and how much interest there is to drive it forward.
Yeah. And I think Tal gave a number of good, let's say options that or things that you could consider or not consider, right? So I think it's already a good list. So maybe we should list that into some requirements, and then. But I would like to, or try to start from the bare minimum, and then try to move the community towards towards CRDs rather than keeping investing in Helm. You see? That's okay. My 2 cents. Thanks.
I think okay. It's my turn or somebody else?
I'm not sure it was Bala or yourself, Bill.
It's you. Go ahead, please.
Okay.
You figured out how to raise your hand anyway.
Sure. Thank you. The Wim about the bare minimum. Okay. So this is ongoing study. And then if we take the flux approach and they leave the existing Helm chart as is, and they are providing wrapper CRD, for example, Helm repository CRD, Helm chart CRD, and then Helm release CRD. So instead of using Helm command to generate the Helm release directly, we still using the Git as the source of truth, and then deploying the CRD, those I mentioned, and then they make it as a Kubernetes API. So for generic Helm, API, and then inside they have a built-in Helm controller, which is operator, so it can be extended. So that means we can do shift right approach a little bit that I'm worried about. And also there's a source controller, and then which get the associated Helm chart and images and all other. So all the CRD is the Flux built-in Helm controller to use this declarative definition to invoke Helm client command there to create the Helm release in the Kubernetes server. So since we are dealing with the packages with the CRD, and then maybe we can use the Nephew, the ecosystem, and then handling packages and distributing to the workload cluster. And also as needed, we can hydration through the customized plugin. So they can generate the customized the value file through the customized controller in Flux. So anyway, they have several approach to provide minimum impact to existing Helm chart and how to provide this declarative and using Git as a source of truth, which conforms to the Nephew to me. So anyway, that's one of the study. So instead of converting the Helm to the CRD upfront, maybe we can go this path. And then since the final goal is the CRD, that's the end game, then we have to consider what to do with the rest of the Helm chart support. Anyway, that's my initial study, and then more to come.
Okay, thanks very much. Good point. Bala.
Yeah. So thanks, Bing. That's a great point. I actually, before I forget, I created an issue in GitHub to track the discussion. So Bing, whatever points that you raised, do you mind adding that as a command to the to the link I said in the group chat here?
Yeah. Okay. If I just drop these notes into that, is that what you mean?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, notes and also Bing's comments about how that could be solved. Probably if it is in that PR, if it is in that GitHub comments, right? It's not a PR, sorry, but everybody can go. We can revisit it. So I think we can have the conversation there as well. So I just wanted to convey that. And the actual reason why I raised a hand was, in my understanding, this whole Helm versus the principles of Nephew just by the looks of it, they are kind of diametrically opposite in the sense that Nephew wants to use tools and technologies which kind of supports WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, kind of an approach. That's where the KPT packages, other things come into the picture. You see the package, you see what exactly you're deploying, and then obviously you mutate through that, and then you generate new ones that gets deployed. Whereas Helm, if Helm chart, if you look at it, unless you render, you absolutely, I mean, anything, any chart of it, of any worth, right? So you, just by looking at the files, you cannot know what's going on unless you actually render the files, because there's a lot of reusable templates there, maybe plugins and all of the things are going on. So just by the first look of it, principally they are in a very different directions. So it would be very interesting to see how we can marry these two words. That's my observation. Maybe if my observation is not correct, please, somebody please correct me here.
I think it's a good observation. And yeah, so I guess there is a certain amount of trade-off here in terms of give and take in terms of support for Helm versus the ability to map into that Nephew WYSIWYG capability. Wim, is your hand still up or is it back up?
Just one more point I wanted to before. Sorry, Wim, I'll give the floor to you in a minute. Yes. So when it comes to the Helm 2 or 3 support, right? So there are two paths we could take. Either we could say we will only support the latest. That's one path. And if the actual motivation of supporting Helm is to preserve the existing investments of enough vendors and telecom providers and help them pave the way towards CRDs or the Nephew way, I would think instead of just saying we support the latest, we should really figure out what is the most used version, either in NF vendors or what is being used by the telecoms, and then make a decision based on that, rather than saying we'll just take the latest. Because if that's the fundamental motivation is to make the transition happen, and also another fundamental motivation is to preserve the existing investment. So I think probably that's very important to consider when we say which version we are going to support. Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, I raised my hand again, Kiri, and for the following, I was just going to, commenting a little bit on what Byung was saying, right, is the following, is that, of course, it would be fantastic. You take a Helm chart, you run it to Flux and you deploy and you're done, right? Now, I think in Nephew at the moment, we are trying to do more, a little bit more than just declarative, but we also, one of the things that we are working on right now is also decoupling network function and infra in with distinct roles and responsibilities. And now I'm talking, if I look at Nokia Helm charts, we blurred that line a lot. So in other words, the Helm charts contain a lot of stuff that is actually not, that is actually has to come from infra. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just take Helm, put it to CRD and you're done, right? There's a bit more involved. So if I would say, if I take, I don't know all the Nokia Helm charts, but I know a number. And there is a change required to actually fit into a Nephew environment, because unless we just say, okay, we render through Kubernetes and that's what we want, but I think we are trying to do more with Nephew than just that. And as such, it might not be a one-to-one, I just take Helm, render it in Kubernetes and we are done. There might be some changes required to do it in the right way. Right. And then we have shift left and shift right and stuff like that. So let's not go there. But what I'm just trying to point out is that it's not just putting a Helm chart and rendering in Kubernetes and you're done. I think we have to do, there is an it has to fit somewhere in the framework.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that comes back to the completeness of support question around how much effort we want to go to in Nephew for 100% compliance, which it sounds like we want to try and do as little as possible. But as much as needed. And
So
whether or not some vendors will take changing their Helm charts in order to support that.
I'm not saying the changes are big, by the way, Kieran, right? So it's not a big change, but it's not zero.
Yeah, exactly.
I understand. I understand. Yeah. Beam, I understand your point. Yeah.
So the other way to, from the requirement gathering, right? Since that's the main thing. So other way to import, it's very important to specify whether are we supporting Helm as a more as a transitory plan versus supporting Helm as a first-class citizen. Supporting Helm as a first-class citizen, what that means is, as Helm evolves, Nephew also evolves to support it. Transitory means, okay, this is where we are gonna support for these many releases, these versions, and after that, we advise you to transition to some other technology. So those are very different statements. And then that also means we could take very different architectural approaches to support it. So we need to distinguish whether it's going to be a first-class citizen support versus a transitory support.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Kieran, first-class citizen is from the modeling packaging perspective, right? Or including the LCM?
Yeah, including the
There's the LCM, I would have said as well, but I mean, I guess
okay.
if I mean, that's my understanding. Maybe
yes,
that's my understanding. That's why okay, got it.
It's basically, we are saying first class means, if I had to enumerate, that we are saying that, okay, you could either bring Helm charts or you could either bring KPT packages. Nephew will support both. So that is what I meant by first class citizen. So whether do we want to take that path?
Yeah,
but I mean, you could say we're going to provide first-class support for Helm 3, but if Helm 3 goes to Helm 4, we're not going to evolve with that, for example. That might be a decision we make, or we might say we support 80% or 70% or 20% of Helm 3 capabilities, or...
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see any more hands up. I think that was a good discussion. We retracked over some of the points we've made in previous meetings, but I think we've also come with some new suggestions, and it's good to get reinforcement. I guess logistically, in order to organize around this, what is the best way to start gathering this information? Is it in a document in, I'm not sure whether it's in GitHub, or is it in a Google Docs doc, or is there a process, or is it in Confluence?
Yeah, I mean, either we are not using Confluence as much, I can tell you that. We're either probably a Google Doc or a GitHub, maybe better ideas.
Is Sana and Kaushik still here? Because
yes, I'm here. I was about to chime in. I was looking for a document that I have discussed with Kaushik already. So basically, our promise at the result of this discussion was to produce a document, and we have always been using Google Docs. So I'm going to sync up with Kaushik, and we will create a new Google Doc. And in that, I will request all the SIG architecture community members to start the discussion from the start. What do we really expect from Nephew? I will start that draft, and then we will gather feedback from the community. What do we really expect from Nephew? What problems do we want to solve? I have been following a lot of discussion on the chat thread as well, where we are talking about shift left and shift right. And Tol has been trying to explain how that would be very useful in the context of edge deployment. But we do need to consider that we have considered Nephew for non-edge deployments as well. So for all those use cases, what benefits do we want to see from Nephew, and how do we satisfy them? And then we come to the concrete requirements on Helm versus CRDs and operators and all that discussion that is happening here. So we'll create the document and we will share that with SIG Automation.
Okay.
If I can share my screen, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so when you're sharing screen, Sana. So obviously from a requirements perspective, I think looks like a Google Doc is good. But like if there are any ideas of how to solve it or anything, like being suggested something, let's put those in that GitHub as a comment so that we can track and we don't lose those chain of thoughts. Thank you.
All right, will do. We have internal discussion, and after that, I'm gonna put into the content in the GitHub.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So once the document is created, do you recommend that we share that with GitHub or the existing comments document that Karen is creating?
I can quite happily dump the comments into the GitHub if that works better for people. Or
okay, perfect.
So in the GitHub, is there a repo for this work item, or is it existing repos?
it seems to be there's a discussion item, which I think is the proposal.
No, number 35, GitHub, the file shared.
So what I can do is just append the well, actually the slide deck that I've created, I just created in my Google account, but I'll just copy the content into the GitHub comments section, and
yeah, that would be
I'll see, can I attach it there as some kind of artifact?
Is it publicly accessible, your docs? You know?
I can make it publicly accessible. There's no problem with that.
Then if it is the case, then you can just put the link there. Maybe.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not used to using all these tools, so I'm just trying to get up to speed with them.
Thanks.
All right. Are you guys able to see my screen? We have 4 minutes left. I will be very quick going through this document. So we'll share this document with the community. I have shared this with Kaushik. I am waiting for him to basically share that with the rest of the community. We went through this session today. Our next steps are to share a requirements document so that we can gather additional feedback from this community. In the next SIG meeting, which is on May 1, Tol, are you okay to basically present that Tosca 2.0 and the service orchestration discussion?
Excuse me. I almost am. It's internal in Google, and we need to clean it up a little bit. But I'll get approval from everybody involved, and we'll do it. And actually, even before that, I can share the document itself, and the community could already start looking and commenting. But yeah, as soon as I can, I will share it.
Good, good call. And I have some outcome discussions, and the outcome is a lot about how do we converge with the existing brownfield, and how do we work with the standard bodies, and not all of it's going to come from your presentation. Maybe you will help us fill in a subset of the information. We will have additional follow-up presentations to basically come to this outcome, and that would be another outcome that SIG architecture has to produce.
But by the way, I will point out that my document kind of looks into support for all kinds of packaging, including Tosca CSAR. So it's not a burning topic like Helm is, but it's there as well.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Tol. So we'll dedicate the next session to this discussion. That's what I'm trying to say. We can come prepared for that. And Tol, we'll review document. You can help support the discussion as well when we are there on May 1st. We have more raised hands.
Sana, quick 2 questions. Liam said May 1st is the holiday for many countries. So maybe you are scheduled for other Monday. I'm not sure. And okay, so
whenever is the next SIG meeting, okay, we will discuss that on our Slack channel. If we have to change it from May 1 to some other date, then I think that would be the agenda for the next following SIG meeting whenever we agree to that.
Okay.
We'll figure that out. I had no idea. Go ahead.
Okay. So second one, Tao, are you going to propose network topology as your next session presentation? Last time you mentioned about mini SO topology.
No, not quite that. I mean, we do have this component, this topology controller that we're designing in SIG Automation, but it's not quite that. And no, I'm not actually proposing solutions. This document is more about analyzing the problem.
Okay, thank you. Just for make sure.
Okay, we'll start with Tol's discussion in the next, whenever that next SIG meeting happens. And I believe we'll have a little bit more discussion around the brownfield requirements. I can also bring some work that I have been internally doing at TELUS, and I will also request other members of the community to bring in ideas to support the discussion on how do we see nephew fitting with the rest of the brownfield in their respective organizations, and what is their view on that. Maybe that will drive some of these documents that we want to produce as a result of these discussions. In one of the future SIG meetings, I have put the tentative date for May 15th. Kaushik and I are also going to talk about the new working groups that we want to create. I have some initial draft created in the same document, which is very draft at the moment. I would say we are getting additional suggestions from SIG Automation that we probably need a working group on the UI team as well, who can provide feedback to the SIG Automation, how we want the UI to become more user-friendly, and from the perspective of this group. So these discussions are still in flight. Your suggestions and feedback is welcome. One of the meetings, we will dedicate our time to review that. And Bernard also wanted to discuss the roles and responsibilities, how that changes in the context of nephew. I think that would also be another interesting discussion we can take in one of the SIG meetings. If that happens on May 29th, it would be the May 29th meeting. Let's see how we stick to the schedule, the way the dates are actually posted. And you can also see the agenda tracker. The sheet is still open for new topics, for new discussions, for your voting, which can actually change the agenda, how we are taking these different topics across these different meetings. You can go ahead and use that. I